Hi everyone, welcome back to another AccuColor webinar series. Today we are very happy to have Tony Gale, BenQ Brand Ambassador, back with us again. He's going to present today his wonderful workshop on creative color from captured output, or output to capture, I should say. But I'm going to hand it off here to Tony, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I am Tony Gale. I'm a commercial photographer here in New York and a BenQ Ambassador. I am going to be going over color, how to use it creatively, both all the way from capturing and making your photo to outputting your photo. I'm also a Sony Artisan of Imagery, a Manfrotto Ambassador, and an X-Rite Colorati. One thing real quick, if you have any questions, you should have a question box on your GoToWebinar menu system there. If you have any questions, please put them in there and Ollie will reach out and read them to me as they come up. So if I say something that you want more depth, more information on, maybe it doesn't make sense, maybe you think I'm saying it wrong and you want to correct me, all of that's totally fine. All right, like I said, I'm a commercial photographer here in New York City, mostly people in portraits. I've been shooting for about 25 years. One thing I want to mention is we are in an exciting time to be photographers. It's absolutely incredible time to do photography. When I started, it was all film. Controlling your color was a lot harder. If you shot slide film and you messed up, that was it. If you shot negative film, you had some flexibility, but there were many, many times I would go to the color darkroom, spend all day printing, pay for that rental time, pay for that paper, take a look at my prints in the morning, the next day, and realized that everything was just a little bit off. And I'd wasted 6 or 7 hours of my time, whatever the darkroom time was, all the paper, and it was all just a little bit off. Now with digital, if you have a good system, if you've got a controlled system, you make it right once and it stays that way. Once your picture is color balanced correctly, the way you want it to be, as long as your monitor is calibrated, as long as you've got a good photo monitor, I use the 321C, a good monitor, good system, it's magic. What we can do now is absolutely magic. The consistency, the reliability. If I want to print a picture I made a year ago, it prints the same way as long as I control everything. I don't have to worry about trying to readjust things. It's fantastic. All right. So we're going to go over creative colors. We're going to talk about color, white balance, RAW versus JPEG. I'm going to briefly mention log, which is a video thing. Color in lighting, color management, bit depth and the importance of that, processing, and then printing and image delivery because you're outputting either via print or digital. So let's talk about color. Color is a little bit subjective. One of the things I'll often see people talk about is this camera or that camera, this brand or that brand has better color or worse color. That's all subjective. Nobody is making a bad camera. I shoot Sony, obviously, that's what I prefer. But nobody's making a bad camera. Any camera, any modern camera, you can get good color out of. So setting that aside, everything else is something you can control. You typically want to be able to control the color in a situation like this. You want the blue sky to look like the blue you saw. You want the red rocks to look like the rocks you saw. It's nighttime. You want it to feel like nighttime. All of that becomes subjective. There isn't really one right color. There is the most accurate color. That is a thing. The color that is most truly representative of how you saw it, or of how it actually is, but that's not necessarily the best color or the right color. That's part of where the creativity with color comes in. We've all photographed at golden hour, I assume, that hour right after sunrise or right before sunset, when the light is super warm. That's warm light. Most people seeing things would say that's not accurate color. was sort of accurate for the moment, but it's not, but it's warm, right? It's not neutral, but it's beautiful light. So color is subjective. Bear that in mind with everything I say. What you want is to be able to control that so that it does what you want. It's the color that you want. It's the light that you want, and that the output is what you want. So the first thing you have to do is control your white balance in your camera. In your camera, you're going to have an assortment of white balance options. You have auto white, daylight, shade, cloudy, tungsten, fluorescent, or several fluorescents, flash. You're going to have custom. You're going to have Kelvin. What those are, auto white, it's frankly what my camera's on much of the time because I'm capturing in RAW so that I can correct the color later. Auto white is the camera looking at the scene, measuring things however it can measure, using its camera brain, and saying, based on what I see, I think the color is this. Most of the time, it gets really close. It's almost never going to be perfect, but it gets very close. Daylight would be daylight, middle of the day, direct sun, roughly 5,500 degrees Kelvin. Shade is actually in the shade in the middle of the day, which is cooler. If you're ever outside and you haven't noticed before, look at how things look in the shade compared to direct sun. Things in the shade are bluer, so the shade white balance corrects for that. Cloudy, also a little bluer. Tungsten or incandescent, the old school screw-in light bulbs that are very warm, usually around 3,200 degrees Kelvin. Fluorescent is frankly all over the place. There's daylight balance fluorescent, there's tungsten balance fluorescent, there's fluorescent that doesn't seem to relate to anything. And the daylight balance fluorescent may or may not look like daylight. The tungsten may or may not look like daylight. Fluorescent's all over the place. You're seeing less and less of it now as it gets replaced by LEDs, but LEDs also can be all over the place. If you're using, photo LEDs that are designed for photography and good, that should be accurate, but the LED bulbs in your house could be anything, just like fluorescence could be anything. Flash is roughly the same as daylight. Custom is setting a white balance using a spectrally neutral source, spectrally neutral gray card typically, or spectrally neutral white card to get exactly neutral color based on the light in front of you. I'll go over a little bit how to do that. If you're shooting video, I really would encourage you to do a custom white balance. I always do a custom white balance when shooting video. And then your camera probably allows you to adjust the Kelvin temperature, probably roughly from around 2,000, which is very, very, very warm, to 10,000, which is very, very cool, in maybe 25 or 50 degree increments. So to give you an idea of what all of that means, here is the same scene, a little apple barn photographed upstate. Everything is the same. The only thing I've done is change the white balance in camera. So the first one's auto white, the daylight, shade, cloudy, the various fluorescents, flash, underwater auto, changing the color temperature. You can see the differences. If you look at the auto white, it's pretty good. It's almost the same as daylight. But if you look at the shade, you can see that it's warmed it up because shade is cool, like we said. So the parts that are direct daylight, direct sunlight, are much warmer. The cloudy's in between. You get to something like the fluorescents, they're all over the place. And then the color temperature, where I'm controlling it directly, you can see, way too warm, way too cool. Similar situation, instead of being outside though, here I am in the PATH station in New York City. Auto white, daylight, shade, cloudy, tungsten, custom. You can see how different each of those are. That custom, it's an example of why to do a good custom, you want to do it off of a spectrally neutral source. I did that custom off the floor because it was gray. If you're doing it off something that is not truly neutral, which that floor was not, you can see that the auto white actually looks better than the custom because the floor is not neutral. I see a lot of people using, just a white piece of paper, something like this, because it looks white, and using that as a custom white balance source, that's not going to be accurate. It may get you close, but it's not correct. Correct being accurate color. If it gets you what you want, like I said, it's subjective. Do what you want. And in a situation like this, maybe you want it to feel less clean. For example, the auto white, or to a lesser extent, the custom, feels a little more sterile. The custom feels very sterile because it's a little blue. Whereas the daylight or the tungsten or the daylight or the shade or the cloudy feels very warm. And sometimes that warmth under artificial light, to me, feels more right. Like, you know, when you're outside under street lights, a lot of them are being replaced by LEDs, which are much cooler. But the old sodium vapor that were super yellow, to me, that's outside at night. And so if I'm photographing outside at night, I want it to look warm. So all of those options are going to be in your menu. Where they are, it's going to depend on your camera. For a custom white, also the exact steps are going to vary, but you go to your custom white settings, you go to set, you get your spectrally neutral source. This is a color checker passport. You click on it, bam, it corrects for the green magenta shift, corrects for the AB shift, it corrects for the color temperature, and now it's neutral. Super easy, super fast. If you're shooting JPEGs, it's a great way to make sure you have accurate color. If you're shooting video, great way to make sure you have accurate color. If you're shooting RAW, I will just shoot the gray card and then correct later. The reason you want to get accurate color at the beginning, and by accurate or the color you would like at the beginning in JPEG or in video, is because you have less latitude to correct it later. In RAW, it doesn't matter. We'll go over that in a little bit when we talk about processing. In RAW, you can correct it all, and there's no negative effect of doing that. With JPEG and video, there is. So we're going to talk about why that is. So here's a picture of a fancy apartment building in Brooklyn. Here's that same picture, way overexposed. Here's that same picture edited to bring it back. So on the left is an image captured in RAW. Looks pretty good. The exact same settings on the upper right on a JPEG. The color is all wonky. I corrected it some more on the lower right, did more corrections to get it closer, and it is closer. But because it was so far off to begin with, it just isn't correctable enough to get it back to where I would want it to be. And that's the case with video as well. Same situation, you're going to run into those same problems. RAW is going to give you more flexibility. However, anybody who says that every professional photographer does anything, or every photographer does anything, is probably someone you shouldn't listen to. There are plenty of professional photographers who use JPEG, sports photographers, photojournalists, for example, other people just because they like it. There's nothing wrong with shooting JPEG if it's getting the results you want. Just bear in mind you need to really pay attention and make sure the color is exactly what you want from the beginning. All right, so color and lighting. You've got daylight. The daylight is what it is. You can't really change the sun and make it a different color. But if you're lighting things with artificial light, you can. So here we have, upper left, we have a strobe on our left, and we have a tungsten-based light source on our right, an incandescent light on our right. So you can see on auto white balance, it's a little weird because the camera is trying to correct for both a cool source and a warm source and trying to sort of split the difference. So the the strobe side, a little bit too warm, but the tungsten side is not quite as warm as it would have been otherwise. It's kind of going in between. Then doing a daylight white balance. So now the left side of the frame is correct, the right side is warm, incandescent. Because it's a small room and some of that flash is bouncing around, you can see that the right side of the frame is a little closer, but it's still a little wonky just because of the light bouncing around. Daylight with the strobe off, way too warm. Incandescent white balance on the lower left with the strobe off, getting pretty accurate. incandescent with the strobe on and the incandescent off, to blue, daylight with strobe on, and then daylight on the lower right with everything on. So your light source impacts what you're doing, but you can use that creatively. So the daylight balance one on the lower right, you might look at that and think, you know, it's kind of cool that that shadow side, it's not really shadow, but that slightly less bright side is a little bit warmer. In film and motion pictures, they do all sorts of crazy stuff with color that photographers don't typically tend to do. I think it's because in some ways, motion is a little bit more forgiving. It's easier to have things very dark or very bright, or the color shifted in a way that isn't as easy with a photo. A photo doesn't necessarily tell the same story if you do that. Something like some of Steven Soderbergh's films uses lots of different color and lots of stuff. You also have a situation like this. This is Havana, Cuba. If you're photographing in the world, there's a lot of different colors of light sources. So you can see that sort of greenish in the foreground, then blue, then very warm, then a little more neutral in the back. In a situation like this, I think that is cool. I really like that. I think it adds some interest. I think it makes it feel more like you have a sense of place. I think that's part of what makes night photography interesting. However, you could, and I'll talk about gels in a little bit as well, you could go in, it would be difficult here, but in a situation where you have a little more control and put color correcting gels on each light to get everything to match. Earlier, I mentioned the sodium vapor lights, the old school street lights, and then the newer LEDs. This is also in Havana. You can see they've switched that part of the city to LEDs, and then they've got the older part that's still the sodium vapor. I like the sodium vapor, but you know the world changes and you got to change with it. So we've done all that. We're playing around with color. I just want to again mention the importance of using a color checker, a gray card. So here I photographed a gray card, different white balances. All you have to do is click on it, boom, it's neutral. And then you just apply it to everything. It doesn't matter how off it is, you can just correct everything. And then you can go in and mess with it, do custom stuff, change whatever you want. Color correction gels, as I mentioned, and we'll talk more about post-production, don't worry, and processing. Color correction gels are pieces of heat resistant, not heat proof, sort of plastic that have a color tint. So this is a CTO, color temperature orange, and a CTB, color temperature blue. You could put a CTB on an incandescent light source to make it closer to daylight because it's warm, so you're making it cool. You could put a CTO on a daylight balanced light source like a flash and make it more match and incandescent. They're really useful tools. They come in every color you can think of, plus green, minus green for fluorescent, all sorts of stuff. There's hundreds of colors. Just put them on. So here we have the same thing set up. So earlier I had the weird colors. Now I've got a CTO on the flash and it balances with the incandescent. So earlier here, we've got the flash on the left, incandescent on the right. They don't match. You can see on the right, it's sort of neutral. Put the CTO on, re-white balance, and now it matches. All right. So it's like magic. You can correct your lights. It's a useful tool. And they don't have to be photo lights. You can put a CTO over a window. You can put a CTO over your bedside lamp. Anything you can put it on, anything you can fit it on, you can put it on. If you put it so it's physically touching a light bulb, it may melt or burn. So bear that in mind. They're heat resistant, but not heat proof. I have melted plenty of gels. You also have the option of adding color that's not daylight, tungsten, all the traditional things we think of, and get all sorts of creativity. So if you're going to do something like this, I have a blue gel and a red gel. I personally feel like it usually works best when you're using at least 2 different colors or 1 color and a neutral light source. So for example, on the right, just red, on the left, blue and red. I think the one on the left is more interesting and more dynamic with the 2 different colors. If you're just going to do a general color cast, you can do that in post-production as well, especially if you shoot raw. You don't even need to put a gel on the light. But as soon as you add 2 colors, it feels intentional. It feels like it was a choice, and I think it's more interesting. Same thing, blue and red or just red. There are times when a single source kind of works. With him and the sunglasses, I actually kind of like the one on the right more. Or here, color on the background, color on one side, neutral on the other side. It all makes it feel intentional and not like a mistake. When you're doing strange things with color, sometimes I feel like you have to go a few extra steps and try a little harder to make sure that it's clear that it was intentional. This is 2 different light sources, a tungsten and daylight balance, 2 LED tubes like this. You can see the highlights in my eyes. All right, so you're coloring your lights. Maybe you want a colored background. It's a very common thing. We all want to put something cool in the background. One of my favorite things is to take a black background like I have behind me now, add a light to it with a color. That's what all of these are, blue, green, and red. By doing that, you get a very saturated color because black doesn't reflect light. So you're not getting it mixed up by other things bouncing back. Only the color is bouncing back because the places that aren't getting your very powerful light aren't really reflecting light. So you get a more saturated color. If you try putting up a white background and put a color on it, it's very difficult to get anything very dynamic or vibrant or saturated because the white is just bouncing back too much light. So this is just a colored gel with a flash, boom. Another great way to do it is to add a colored gel that matches, or a colored light that matches the color of the background. So this is an orange seamless with an orange gel on the light. So it's orange on orange, gets much more saturated. And even where the light is, there's still the saturation because the background itself is that color. Same thing here with blue. All right, I know I'm going kind of quickly. I just want to make sure I get through everything. You've taken your pictures, you played with your color, everything is happy, you're great. Now it's time to bring it into the computer. So let's talk about color management. To me, color management is the control of color across multiple devices. So having one thing that you control the color on isn't really color management. It needs to be your entire system. So if your camera is set exactly right, but then you bring it into your computer and you don't have a good monitor and your monitor isn't calibrated, then when you start doing things, it's hard to know what's actually happening. So you want accurate and predictable results. You want it to be exactly what you want it to be. That's where something like a good BenQ monitor comes into play. I use the SW321C. I did just learn now that if you were to buy a BenQ photo model or designer model monitor, you get a 1-year subscription to Pantone Connect for free, which is very cool. You want color accurate, you want photo. I was told when I was starting out to buy the best equipment you can afford. Ali and I were talking earlier. I very much believe that BenQ is excellent monitors, and what you're getting for that price is absolutely incredible. So when you're looking at a monitor, take a look at the contrast ratio, take a look at the color gamut. That's very important. So, and we'll talk about why in a second. The color gamut is how much color information the monitor can show you. So for example, this is the 321C. It's 100% of sRGB 1998, 99% of Adobe RGB. What that means is If you're taking a picture, you're probably using Adobe RGB or sRGB. You're seeing the colors as they are. If you have a monitor that does not have a color gamut that's that wide, like 99% of Adobe RGB is excellent. There are monitors available that are maybe 90% of Adobe RGB. What that means is there's colors in your picture that are on the computer that exist, but you're not seeing them represented the way that they are. So when you start going in and changing the color or adjusting your exposure or doing other things, you're making changes you can't actually see, which makes it difficult to really get what you want. All right. That's why a good monitor matters. We also want to talk about bit depth. So bit depth is the number of colors per channel available in an image. So your typical JPEG, well, all JPEGs really, are 8-bit color, 16.7 million colors. Sounds great. That sounds like a lot of colors, and it is. It's 256 colors per channel, so that's 256 reds, 256 greens, 256 blues. If you go up to 14-bit, which most DSLR and mirrorless cameras are capable of, all of a sudden you're at 16,384 colors per channel, which is 4.4 trillion colors, which makes your 16.7 million seem not so much. And then if you have a camera that will do 16-bit, 281 trillion colors. When you're processing, you're not going to have the choice to process out to 14-bit. It's going to be 8 or 16. I, 99% of the time, am processing out into 16-bit. I want all the information that's available to me. I want it all. I can always make it smaller later. And then we mentioned 100% of sRGB or 99% of Adobe RGB 98. This is from the X-Rite website. The white box is Adobe RGB. That's the amount of colors that Adobe RGB can represent. sRGB is a smaller color space. There are less, but there are things that can't really represent Adobe RGB in 1998. Web browsers used to have a problem with it. It's less of an issue now, but maybe you're sending it to your mom and you're pretty sure your mom does not have a good computer monitor. She maybe needs a nice new BenQ for Christmas. You might want to convert to sRGB so that what they're seeing is what you want them to see. But when you're working, you might want that wider color space. So there's just more information. It's not, there's still 256 colors per channel if you're an 8-bit, but the reddest red is redder in Adobe RGB 98, for example. There's also CMYK, which you're not going to work with. It's a 4-channel thing with 256 colors per channel, but one of them is black. CMYK is really for printing, offset printing. The only time I ever use CMYK is at the end, if a client asks me to convert to CMYK. So I mentioned that it's still 256 colors per channel. What it is essentially is that it's just a wider range. So sRGB is here, Adobe RGB 98 is a wider range. You've got something like ProPhoto RGB, even yet more wide range. So here, if you imagine the inner part is sRGB, and then you can get more orange and more light orange with Adobe RGB 98, and even yet more orange and even yet lighter, more orange with ProPhoto RGB. All right. So let's talk about processing. Do you want to process out as a JPEG or a TIFF? JPEG is a compression. TIFFs are typically uncompressed. You can do the LZW compression with a TIFF. JPEGs take up less space, but the quality degrades over time with every save. It won't degrade if it just sits there, unless you get bit rot or something or corruption. But every time you open a JPEG, change something, and then resave it, or just open it and resave it, it's recompressing and it's losing a little bit of information. So if you do that enough times, the picture degrades. With a TIFF, you can open it, save it, open it, save it, open it, save it. Because it's lossless, the image quality shouldn't degrade. I always process out as TIFFs, and then if I need to deliver a JPEG to someone, I'll make a JPEG of it, but I always process out as TIFFs. You can also do 16-bit with TIFFs. You can't do 16-bit with JPEGs. And you can do layered files and all of that. 8-bit or 16-bit, we talked about the difference in that. I always do 16-bit. It does take up twice as much space, and I will typically convert to 8-bit to deliver to someone. I usually will deliver 8-bit JPEGs. And then Adobe RGB 98, sRGB, or ProPhoto RGB. I typically do Adobe RGB 98 because that's the one that is represented by what's available to us visually, so I can see what the colors are doing. All right, so you've done all that. You've decided if you're going to do JPEGs or TIFFs. If you want to do JPEGs, do JPEGs. You're not wrong for doing that. Just make sure that it's a choice you're making. If you're not sure, shoot RAW plus JPEG, or just reprocess the RAW. It's important to calibrate your monitor. Why calibrate your monitor? Because you want to make sure that what you're seeing is an accurate representation of how the file actually is. Several years ago, I was listening to a photo podcast with people that I felt like should have known better, who said they don't calibrate their monitor because nobody else calibrates theirs, so why should they bother? You can't control if other people calibrate your monitor or not. That's not something that you can do unless you go there and calibrate it for them. But you can control that your monitor is accurate, so when you send a file or put a file on your website or print it or whatever, that it started out the way it was supposed to be. So in the middle here, we've got this picture I took in Florida with how I like the color in the middle. On the left is +10 cyan, +10 blue. On the right is +10 red, +10 yellow. So warmer on the right, cooler on the left. If my monitor is accurate and in the middle, and someone's monitor is a little cool, yeah, it's a little off, but it's not terribly far off. If their monitor is a little warm, yeah, it's a little off, it's not terribly far off. However, if my monitor is a little bit blue and their monitor is even more blue, now we're starting to get into very far off. Same thing with warm. If you're off and then someone else is more off, that's going to be a more dramatic difference. Or if they're off in the opposite direction, it just gets messy. Plus, if you're going to print anything like that, calibrate your monitor. Monitor calibrators are not that expensive. It's not hard to do. The BenQ monitors have software that they come with. You still need the puck, or the photo monitors at least. It's worth doing. Take the time, do it. It's really not hard. You can see as we get further away how much of a difference it can make. All right, everybody's going to go and calibrate your monitor, right? All right, let's talk about color correction. This is a gentleman out in Brooklyn. Not the best frames because I just had to do a bunch of frames in a row with different white balances. You can see the color is different on all of them. Here we are with a nice color checker. This is in Lightroom. All you do, take the eyedropper in Lightroom, pick the neutral target. So you can probably use any of the ones on the bottom, any of the whites or grays. You're better off with a gray because it's not going to be blown out and it's not going to be too dark. You just click on it, boom. You select all of the pictures you want to convert. You say sync. It comes up. You make sure that color is selected. You see color grading is there, and white balance on basic is there. Boom, they're all the same. Because I'm photographing in RAW, I can do that. There's no issues with image quality. Everything is fine. It's just the same as if I'd done it correctly in camera from the beginning. That is the power of shooting in RAW and using a color checker. You also have things like, so you're doing that, and then let's talk more about processing. So you've done your gray card. Here's 3 pictures as shot, and then maybe you want to use the software your RAW processing software to just do it. So this is as shot. This is using Capture One and doing auto color correction. Daylight, shade, cloudy, tungsten, daylight white fluorescent, flash, custom white balance. So in your raw processor, Capture One or Lightroom or whatever you use, you have a drop down for different white balances. So if you didn't shoot a gray card and things aren't working, just go through those drop downs. The custom white is just me moving the slider, flash, daylight white fluorescent. Just try the different ones and see what gets you close. And then from there, use the sliders and just do a custom and adjust. Here are a bunch of different options using auto, flash, shade, cloudy, tungsten, all of the different ones, and a custom. Same scene, different color grades, different white balances. Which one of these is the best is subjective, right? I definitely don't like the most neutral one. The two most neutral ones are the least interesting to me. I like it to be warm. That's an example where neutral color is not necessarily good color. On the other hand, you may look at this and feel like, you know what, the neutral color is the good one. If that's how you feel, that's great. There's no wrong answers here. Skin tone, you probably want neutral color. You might want it a little warm. Somebody like this is Janet Mock. Having good neutral color, which represents her skin tone accurately, very important to me. I've photographed people who have asked me to make sure that their skin tone is represented correctly. And especially if that's the case, I think it's important for those of us who photograph people to honor that. I want to represent people the way that they are. You have something like this. This is Watkins Glen State Park in upstate New York. Warmer on the left, cooler on the right. Neither of them is correct. Neither of them is neutral, but the cooler one is the one I like better. Cooler on the left, warmer on the right. This was not late in the day, but by adding the warmer color balance, it feels like it is, and I feel like it's a much more interesting picture. Neutral on the right, cool on the left. Again, I think the cooler is a much more interesting picture. So accurate color is not always the best color. Florence, glacier up in Alaska, neutral on the right, cool on the left. Which one do you like better? I like the blue one. You have situations like this. This is a couple days after Manhattanhenge in New York City. That low light, that golden hour light we talked about, you don't want to neutralize that or you lose the entire effect. You want that warmth. And that is something that auto white can sometimes not do well. If you've ever photographed the sunset, especially with your phone, and then wondered why the colors don't look the way that they look to your eye, it's because your phone is trying to make everything neutral. It doesn't know that it's beautiful light. It's trying to make it neutral. So you've got to tell things what to do. All right, so let's talk more about processing. This is Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw. In any raw process, well, in Lightroom and in Capture One, I shouldn't say any raw processor because I don't know them all. You also have a choice of sort of color recipes beyond the standard stuff. So you can see there's a drop down with various different Adobe profiles. So the profile is a way that it interprets the color, and it's always going to apply some profile. You can decide which profile you want. So for example, Adobe Standard, Adobe Color, I don't know if you can see, it's a little more contrasty. Adobe Portrait, Adobe Vivid, much more saturated. A custom profile. The custom profile is one I built using software. If you look at the difference between Adobe Standard and the custom, you can see some of the colors aren't quite the same. Like the sky is a little different. If you look at the sidewalk, the warmth of it is a little different. The reds of those little grippy things are a little different. The red of the brick is a little different. That's not a white balance thing. That is a color profile thing. The color profile, if you really want accurate color, is what you need to work with. Adobe Color on the left, custom on the right. You can see it, especially if you look at the greens and a little bit the warmth of his skin, you can see there's some differences. Adobe Color, custom. And then you get into some things where controlling that really makes a difference. So I've done some work for a workwear company, catalog company. Straight ahead camera on the left with a color checker custom profile on the right, huge difference. In Capture One, you have similar things. They don't call them the same. Obviously, they're not going to say Adobe if it's Capture One. But you're typically going to have a profile based on your camera. So this is Sony Alpha 1, Pro Standard, generic. You can see the differences. To get into there, you go to ICC Profile. In Lightroom, they're ICM profiles. And you can select what's available. So Sony Alpha 1 Pro Standard, there's generic, there's Pro Standard. You can collect show all, and there's just a ton. Every camera you can think of is in there. It doesn't even have to be the same camera manufacturer that you use. You can try different things, and you can see how much of a difference it makes. Like using something shot with the Alpha 1 with the RX1 profile, probably not great. All right, so that's, in particular, that color profile is something that I think is often overlooked, but matters a lot. Then we get into printing and image delivery. So for output, right, we started with capture, taking pictures, using that white balance. Now we have output. What is the end goal of the photo? Do you want it online? Are you printing it? What do you want to do? Then you want to decide if you want Adobe RGB, sRGB, ProPhoto RGB, CMYK. Are you printing at home, printing through a fulfillment service, emailing to your mom, sending to a client? If you want to convert a processed file to a different profile, so maybe you're working in Adobe RGB 98 and you want to deliver an sRGB, or your printer wants sRGB or CMYK or whatever, you want to make sure you go to edit, convert to profile. You do not want to assign a profile. So edit, convert to profile. There are times when it doesn't make that much of a difference. So there's the original on the top, assign profile on the bottom, convert profile on the lower right. Not a huge difference, but something like this, very big difference. So converting the profile, because something like Adobe RGB 98 has a wider color space than sRGB, Convert tries its best to get it as close as it can to what you're trying to represent. Assign just says, okay, boom, let's squeeze everything. And it can look terrible. Like with the originals on the left, assign profiles in the middle, that looks awful. That's like not even close. And convert is on the right. Always convert, never assign. All right. Thanks for listening. Let's see if there are any other questions.
Okay, Tony, we have a few questions from Christopher.
Okay.
I'm gonna write them off to you. So first, when you upgrade Photoshop to keep it current, does it default to 8-bit in preferences? So you have to reset the preferences to 16-bit?
So that's a good question. I actually don't know that because I'm not processing in Photoshop. So I'm assigning 16-bit when I process, either in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw or Capture One. So Photoshop isn't going to convert it to 8-bit unless I tell it to. So whatever you have in your preferences, which I would expect it to keep, but you never know, shouldn't matter because whatever profile it is you're starting with should stick. I hope that answered the question.
Okay, and then furthermore, he's asking, is it TIFF or DNG? And then
so
processing HDR and Photoshop equals ProPhoto 32-bit question mark?
All right, so a DNG is a digital negative. It's an alternative RAW format. So it's not a processed file. It's just, you could convert your ARW file to a DNG file if you wanted, and it's just one RAW format for another RAW format. So once you bring it into Photoshop and you want to start doing layers and things like that, you're going to want to process it to a TIFF. And then what was the second part of the question? Oh, HDR.
Yeah, processing in HDR in
So
Photoshop.
HDR in Photoshop is 32-bit. Honestly, I don't know if it's ProPhoto RGB or even if it's anything, because I don't think ProPhoto RGB is 32-bit. But I'm not sure. I honestly don't know. But HDR in Photoshop is 32-bit, although then to really do anything with it, you have to convert it to 16-bit, because whatever device you're looking at it on can't really see 32-bit anyway. So when I do HDR, after I've done it, I almost immediately convert it to 16-bit.
Okay, and Christopher had another question. Maybe I can help answer this one. Are BenQs current with updating for Mac M1 and M2 processors? Yes, Christopher, they are. So the monitors will be fully compatible, and then the monitor calibration software for the hardware calibrated photography monitors, it's called Master Element, that's going to be compatible with the older Intel Macs and even the M1 and M2 processors as well.
Excellent.
And Tony, one more from Christopher.
Sure.
Do you create a color checker color profile for each of your camera bodies?
I do. I do, because the different camera bodies have different sensors, so how those interpret color is a little different, and how beyond just how it captures it with the sensor, how it converts it into a raw file is a little different. So I do a different custom profile for each camera body. And if it's a very color important image, like maybe I'm photographing for a catalog where the color needs to be as accurate as possible, I will build a new color profile for every lighting setup, uh, because even that could change things a little bit. In day-to-day things, I just have a profile for each camera body and I'll use that.
That looks like the last question, but Tony, one from me. Okay, wait, spoke too soon. One more just popped in now. It's, let's see, more of a compliment from Chip. Thank you for covering the noting correct versus creative color. I have Brooks trained pro photographer friend that does not get creative gel color theory. So yeah, just thank you, Chip. I'll send that over to you as well, Tony. But
Thank
my
you.
question, if we want to carry on this conversation further, what's the best way to reach you out of these options up here?
Email probably. You can find my email on my website. However, if you reach out with a question and I do not get back to you, just reach out again. Like for example, right now I've got a ton going on. I've got every day this week, every day next week, every day the following week I'm shooting. So if you email me and I don't get back to you right away, I'm not ignoring you. I just got distracted. So just reach out again.
Excellent. Tony, I don't see any more coming through. Just some more thank yous and comments. You're most welcome, Christopher, Chip. You guys are both very welcome. Tony, thank you for presenting for the BenQ AccuColor webinar series. We're always glad to have you. We're happy to have you as a brand ambassador, and just privileged to learn as much as we can from you.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure. Thanks everybody, and thanks for all those questions, Christopher.
Thank you, everyone.